this debate hosted by Tim Pool took two people from the Twitch poll sphere, from the political debate sphere, in our area, or at least my old space, or the space I still retain myself in to some degree. And it was Wick, the debate host, and Lactoid, the libertarian right debater. Now, we've debated Lactoid before on the show, and we've interacted with Wick before on the show. And they're being hosted on Tim Pool's program. Tim Pool, the Ukraine is the #1 enemy of America pool, enemy of the world pool. So when that's the foundation for your discussion, is Ukraine is the enemy of the world, that's the person hosting it, you have to be pretty disciplined to not allow that perspective to influence how you're shaping the conversation, and to do it as an unbiased host. I'm hoping that is what can be achieved, but I believe that just through that framing, he's going to believe that certain framings are worth time that probably aren't. And he's going to, I think, give more air to areas that should probably be deflated so we could focus on more like crucial issues. For example, I think a more valid conversation is economic sustainability of aid. You can have a valid conversation about that. But if we're instead talking about the legitimacy of Yanukovych and, oh wait, Victoria Nuland, and well, then we're not informing the population about Ukraine. We're misinforming them. We're bringing the conversation down. And even if we're not getting anywhere, we're just wasting their time. We're just wasting their time. So the foundation, already worried about. Then you throw Lactoid in there. Now, I've had conversations with Lactoid before about Ukraine. A short one during our election night stream, and one during a debate we had. I believe it was on Wick Show. I think Anastasia was there, and there was somebody else on the other side. I really don't remember who it was. But Lactoid, in that conversation, he knows more than I would say than your average poster about Ukraine when it comes to some of the history. But I feel like when I listen to him talk about Ukraine, especially when he gets to any specifics, like where you have to dig into the conversation, like with Euromaidan, it sometimes sounds like listening to someone use a new word that they don't totally understand, but they want to use because they just learned it. And you're trying to watch them try to get mastery of that word. I don't want to use the description of a child learning a new word because I don't want to be demeaning, but that's the reception I got when it came to Euromaidan. If I'm being generous, the other way would be he's just slimy. He was just being slimy and trying to drag the conversation away to Euromaidan, and then he just got out of his depth. But either way, I didn't walk away from that conversation thinking that he was necessarily concentrating on the best areas to even make his own argument. And so it's not that I would necessarily say that Lactoid can't make a good argument about Ukraine in isolation. It's that once you get into the conversation with Lactoid, especially when you get into specifics about Euromaidan or the legitimacy of Yanukovych or just the timeline of events, then you find it's not that he's one layer deep, he's 2 to 3, right? Which is better than the average bear. But when you still divert us to these conversations about like Yanukovych's legitimacy, and then you don't understand the order of events for Euromaidan, then again, you have the same problem that you would have with, I would say, with any other number of Ukraine right-wing debaters, which is just a lack of knowledge about the situation on the ground. And it just, this information being regurgitated through so many different talking heads like Scott Horton and others, that it kind of poisons your mind a bit. That's my good faith interpretation of it, to try to like assume a lack of maliciousness. Anyway, and then you have Wick on the other side, which is supposed to be there to push back against, maybe any misinformation or, let's say, a lack of dedication for liberal values when it comes to, wait, let's talk about what it means to have a civil society versus what it means to be in occupied territory. That's going to be Wick's job.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt.
That's going to be Wick's job. Whether or not he can do that, he could just retreat to the basics of national sovereignty. But I am worried about Wick's ability to not only stay on this, let's just say, shaky platform. Not shaky as in it's like a failing show, but shaky as in I don't think the foundations for a good conversation are there. But we'll see. And against somebody who will drag Wick into the specifics that I don't know if he knows about. about Euromaidan, because I saw Lactoid divert into other topics completely in a totally different realm once he would get cornered on an idea of, like, for example, the thing he got cornered on that got us diverted to Euromaidan was, you know, can we, guarantee, can we control for the externality of stopping Russia from invading again under your plan? Do you have a solution for that? And his answer was no. So we diverted away. And so I'm hoping Wick has the ability to get to the places Lactoid doesn't have answers to. And then from there, maybe you can have, like, I think, an honest conversation. That's the hope. I don't really think there's going to be an honest conversation, but I'm going to hope for it. That's a false hope. By the way, I'm not going to watch this to its end. I don't think it's like, what is this, like over 2 hours?
Champ has donated $5. Would you go on Tim Pool? You would destroy him on Ukraine.
Yeah. And, Connor said that he would talk to somebody, but I mean, if they want me on, I'll go on. I can get out there. I have family in West Virginia. I can go up there and crash with family on the mountain and then come down. I'd like to go back to Yee Mountain Country anyway. But, I'm not the person with the keys. Let's get started.
What does that resolution actually look like? And what should we as Americans do? We're going to debate the issue. We got a couple of gentlemen joining us to have this discussion. Sir, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Name's Wick TV, and I run a podcast on YouTube of the same name. And I'm here to support Ukraine and advocate that we continue to aid Ukraine and even ramp it up a little bit.
Oh, interesting. And then, sir, who are you?
Yeah, I'm Lactoid. You can find me at Lactoid TV on Twitch, X, and YouTube. I am a libertarian lawyer. My position on this is that it's time for the U.S. to withdraw funding and to keep that money here at home.
All right. Well, this should be fun, my friends. If you're just tuning in, smash the like button. Of course, share this show far and wide. It's Friday morning. The culture war is live, and we're going to be having this debate. So share the show if you really do enjoy it. So who wants to go first? Why we should or should not be supporting this country?
I'll take it away. So here, look, Ukraine has been unjustly invaded by an aggressive force, Russia. This isn't the first time Russia has invaded other countries. They did it in Chechnya. They did it in Georgia. They did it before in Ukraine in 2014, and they're doing it again now. The idea that if we suddenly withdraw our funding, if we withdraw our forces, if we decide to just, let Putin have this little bite now, that he will somehow stop, is ludicrous. It's naive. Putin will not stop. He must be stopped. We have a situation where we are and should be funding more money into Ukraine, because that money doesn't just go to Ukraine. It goes to American jobs in American factories, building American weapons to fight America's enemies and support America's allies. We made in 2024 $316 billion selling foreign weapons selling our weapons to foreign countries. This dwarfs the numbers that we've given in aid to Ukraine. And this demand spiked in 2024 by 26%, in part because we have shown ourselves, at least to some degree, to be a reliable ally. And so Poland, the Netherlands, other countries want to take and help rearm. They're up in their GDP, but there's more money out there than there is stuff. So we have an opportunity now to rebuild our industrial base and use Ukraine as a way to do that, because there's other conflicts coming. We have a trade war with China coming up, right? Trade wars can often turn into something a little bit hotter, and it behooves us to be prepared for that. And I think Ukraine is a good reason to do so. That's my argument.
I think you did okay. I'm not one for leaning into the job creation when it comes to manufacturing, because you could probably do more efficient per capita job creation investing that money elsewhere. I think a better argument is about the necessity of not just producing low quantity but high cost missiles that can take out a guy in a cave 1,000 miles away, but mass amounts of steel and TNT, so that in a short period of time we could ratchet up ammunition production that would be necessary for the type of large scale interstate conflict that, while we would want to avoid, is in the modern age not an impossibility, when I think a lot of us have kind of resolved ourselves to the idea that the future of warfare is just fighting dudes in caves because, you know, we're past this now. Obviously, that's not the case. Outside of that, I think that when I would go, if I was to go on Tim, I'd probably section my areas of my opening statement into two areas. One would be the reasons of want, not the reasons of want, the reasons of nation state interest to support Ukraine, therefore America's selfish interest, since it's an American program, and then you'd go into the morality of it. And I think that a lot of these areas overlap. And I don't want to get into all of the specifics of I changed this and I changed that. But for example, American credibility. There is a real there's not like a real physical credibility you can hold on to, and it's not something you can put like a, hey, I just put the thermometer in the credibility scale. But your nation state being taken credible when it comes to the agreements like the Budapest Memorandum or other agreements you make with other nation states, or memorandums or any declaration or agreement you make, if you violate it, and then if you promise nation states things and then go back on those promises, that lack of credibility can make it harder for you to make deals in the future, or mean you're going to have to invest more for them to take the risk of trusting the United States, which, while some people can say is crazy, look at the companies taking their money out of, securities that used to be considered safe here on U.S. soil or bonds. That's not even to talk about the dollar's price right now, but Trump has conflicting ideas when it comes to what the dollar should be priced at. Either way, I think that portioning this out into an ethical section where you could say, hey, the morality of credibility, I think that if we make an agreement, we should uphold it. We should not act like a den of snakes. Well, also it has overlap when it comes to how our nation state should avenue itself on the world stage for its own benefit, as in, we want other states to look at us credibly. Now, this is just one issue. I could get into the others. For example, our integration across the Euro-Atlantic, which Trump has in some ways acknowledged by backing off of the tariffs after people got yippee. It could be the fulfillment of our commitments, which help our security in the long run. After Europe came to help us after 9/11, we come to help Europe in their time of security crisis because, as a stronger body of over 1 billion souls, we have more influence on the world stage economically and militarily than as a body of 330 million souls. You could go issue by issue, issue by issue. But I really like this idea of dividing it ethically and in your own nation state's interest, because I think you can cast the widest net with the audience. You're getting the people who are just there to think what is best for my country, and you're getting the people who I think really believe in the morality of the Ukrainians not being hunted in Kherson anymore.
Yeah, I mean, my argument's pretty straightforward. I think we've been sold a lie when it comes to the war in Ukraine. We've been sold this tale of a David versus Goliath, this fledgling democracy that's being threatened by this massive authoritarian power, when the reality is the truth is much more complicated. I mean, here we are $200 billion later, and all we—
By the way, can I just throw out there, it is a David versus Goliath. We can say it's not David versus Goliath because you don't exactly agree with, well, their side isn't completely good and their side is completely bad. I disagree with where he makes that point, by the way. We'll probably get into that later. But it's still David versus Goliath. It's a country that's, 1/12 the size, 1/15 the size of the largest nation on the planet. It's got 1/5, 1/6 the population, much less of the artillery production, much less of the equipment. And through blood, sweat, and struggle, they've kept their country over 3 years of the most bloody European wars since World War II. So it is a David versus Goliath story. It's just whether you just don't think David has, valid enough reasons.
Managed to buy for ourselves is about 500,000 dead, probably more at this point. Another 500,000 wounded, some critically, probably more at this point. And this was all done in service of a power structure in Ukraine that's becoming increasingly authoritarian, a power structure that was founded upon a illegal and unconstitutional coup.
This is what we're starting with. This is where we're going for. Really? And the thing is, this is like one of the few opportunities we're going to get to have a legitimate conversation about continuing to support Ukraine. This is the few opportunities that's ever going to happen on Tim Pool's show. Few opportunities it's ever going to happen. And now we're going to go back to Victoria Nuland. We're going to go back to, oh, well, Yanukovych, you know, he was duly elected. And so when they started beating those protesters with gangs, they should have just, you know, went home when they banned protesting. I'm a libertarian. Go home when the government bans protesting. I'm a libertarian. Like, this is where I don't believe it. I don't believe this is what he thinks. I remember when we tried to have a conversation, if Joe Biden hired MS-13 to go brutalize protesters protesting against him, going back on his word before he outlaws protesting, and would you? And he wouldn't answer like, well, that's different. Why you? That's a totally different scenario. He won't answer it because if we were to apply libertarian values to this equation, you cannot end up on the side of Yanukovych. Yanukovych, in the middle of the night, pulled out of the association agreement, which he promised on the campaign trail he was going to be in, after Russia economically coerced them, which Lactoid doesn't know this. I asked him directly during the last debate. He doesn't know about what made Yanukovych actually pull out of the association agreement. He doesn't know what incited Euromaidan in the first place, and this is one of the first things he brings up. This is what I mean. He's not one layer down, he's 2 layers down. He's past Victoria Nuland. He still doesn't know about the economic coercion, about the trade being cut off at the border, which pressured Yanukovych to go back on his word. He did it at the middle of the night, meaning he tried to suppress the reaction by telling everybody in his country about it when they were asleep so they wouldn't protest. Some did anyway. They were brutalized, and the rest is history. Out of all the places to start somewhere about, you know, should America be sending aid in the first place as a libertarian? That's somewhere I think it's a valid philosophical disagreement. Go somewhere where we could talk about, you know what is the viability of war going forward? Now, I don't think Lactoid really knows that much about the reality on the battlefield. But I mean, I think that, you know, this is a legitimate conversation. We're nowhere near a legitimate conversation now. We're nowhere near it. So you want to talk about illegitimacy? Can we please get to the stuff that matters? It's been a decade and we're still regurgitating the same crap when we're 3 years into the second invasion after that.
That disenfranchised millions of people in the East that we just don't seem to care about. We didn't seem to care about.
By the way, those people voted for Zelensky. Just want to throw that out there. The Eastern Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for Zelensky. I'm just throwing that out there. Like it'd be like, oh, we disenfranchised those people. Well, if they never got another vote and didn't get to say what they believe, if those people haven't been polled since then, but they have. It's not like one election and then you just get to the next election no matter what. If your democracy has a crisis, if the president of the United States ever at any point came out and tried to ban protesting, recruited MS-13, at that point, they have lost their legitimacy. This might be where the philosophical disagreement is. Maybe Lactoid thinks that if a government's been elected, that they can do whatever they want to the civil rights of people, and there's just really nothing they can do about it. Maybe that's his position. Maybe, but I don't believe it because he's a libertarian, or he says he's a libertarian. I don't believe he would think, well, you know, if Joe Biden decided that those 20 Trump supporters had to go that way, you know, and now they're 6 feet under, it's just, I don't believe it.
About it in 2014, but it's the direct cause of what's going on now. And on top of all of that, Ukraine is losing, and Ukraine continues to lose every single day, despite the fact that we're dumping money into it. And last time I brought this up, you know, you and your comrades kept hammering, well, Kursk, they have.
Am I the comrades? Am I the comrades? We're the comrades now. We don't even get our name mentioned. We're the comrades.
Kursk is gone, right?
No, it's not.
Ukrainians have lost Kursk.
They have not.
They lost most of it. They lost 80% of it. They still have some area over the border. They went across the border in Belgorod and grabbed a little bit, but they functionally have lost all of Kursk after the Trump administration. I mean, we can say it wasn't caused by that, but I think that part of the reason they're not saying it was caused by that is to soften diplomacy with Trump. But I think the intelligence pool was utilized by the Russians to try to add pressure. The Russians utilized it to add pressure with their offensives. Whether or not that was the deciding factor is still up in the air. But that's one of the tools that Ukraine had. It no longer has that negotiating chip in large part. That is true. But they have other chips as well. Long-range Ukrainian drone strike program is continuing to evolve, continuing to expand, and continuing to have devastating effect. Now, the ceasefires might change that, since the Russians are trying to protect their energy infrastructure for good reason, by the way. They fund 35% of their budget through it. But Ukraine still has that card in its deck, its long-range strike card. It still has more of the population that can be mobilized. It still has cards at the table. And so it's one thing to say, Ukraine, you taking back all of Crimea is not that realistic. Let's find something that's more realistic so we can give a reasonable proposal forward to end the war, versus concede everything, give everything up, give up even the land that you currently hold, like Kherson and Zaporizhia. Give them a river crossing, which is currently what the Russians are demanding. And it's what Steve Witkoff is, at least in one proposal, offering to the Trump administration as the fastest way to end the war. It's also the fastest way to reignite the war in a few years.
They still have forces in Kursk today. Not as much, right? Not as much of Kursk, but today.
They have a single-digit percentage fraction of what they had, and the Russian forces are moving into Sumy. I'm following the war every single day. The Russians make gains every single day. The Ukrainians lose ground every single day, and we're dumping money into this dumpster fire.
Let's start here. Why did Russia?
I don't think this dumpster fire. Here we go.
Invade Ukraine.
When I hear that type of language, and and after hearing like this appeal to the legitimacy, and it's hard for me to believe he cares. I got the same impression during my last conversation. We're 5 minutes in. Mike, I gotta just. You know what I need? I need that needle therapy. That's what I need.
Well, Russia has always wanted to regain Ukraine. So Putin has said many times in his interview with Tucker Carlson and in speeches and in other statements that he wants to regain the imperial power of Russia, to establish greater Russia. And Ukraine, in his mind, is part of that project. He believes that they are ethnically Russian, that Ukrainians don't exist in a real way, and he just wants to bring them into his fold, right? That's his belief structure, and that's why he's doing this. This nonsense that people will say about, like, oh, it's NATO expansion, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. It's not. Putin has been very clear. He's doing this because he believes that Ukraine doesn't exist and Ukraine is part of Greater Russia, and he'll have it back.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of American propaganda version of whenever the enemies are going to,
that's what Putin has said.
Well, no, it's more complicated than that. As I think we're going to visit a lot here, a lot of the claims here that are being made are more complicated.
The world is so gray. So gray.
There's more gray area than I think you're giving.
Come on. Okay.
Credit for. The reasons for the war in Ukraine are complex, and there's many of them. But some of the main issues are the disenfranchisement of millions of people in Crimea and the Donbass and really the east of Ukraine.
Snooze. It's not, they didn't invade because of the disenfranchisement of the people of eastern Ukraine. They wouldn't do sham referendums if that was the case. They also wouldn't have rigged them in advance, and they certainly wouldn't have held the Crimean legislators at gunpoint, as Igor Girkin said. He publicly testified, and he was deeply involved in the military actions of the time as a former FSB agent operating in occupied territories. Like, oh, the legitimacy of those people, the legitimacy of those elections, they were not treated legitimately at all by the Russians. And it's not like the Ukrainians had declared, okay, we'll never have an election again. They did have elections. They were scheduling future elections. The Ukrainians even offered to negotiate with the Russians about the renewal of their lease in Crimea. It just wasn't enough. The Russians took advantage of the chaos.
That happened in 2014 when there was a unconstitutional, unpopular coup that took place.
I already had this conversation with him. He should know better. And we're still here. Like, this matters to him. I'm sorry, man. I thought for a second, for a moment, maybe this time it would be about the present war.
place.
It's a distraction.
It's not a distraction. That matters. If we care about constitutional order and we care about democracy, we can't just ignore it when
It's
it
such bullshit. I don't believe it. He's bullshitting Wick. He's bullshitting Tim. He bullshit me. I don't believe when we care so much about constitutional order, then, you know, the president can do whatever he wants to his people. If you're elected today, you can rape your wife tomorrow. It doesn't matter. He's the president. He has the right to hire gangs. He has the right to ban protest. He has the right to go back on his promises. He has a right to take illegal actions himself. Do you think hiring gangs is legal? Do you think it's legal to hire street gangs to brutalize your own population? At what point are you saying, like, at what point does this become a certain amount of you're just trying to find a way to say, because I'm sure, look, I can point to things that happened during Euromaidan that was awful, right? Where I can find a protester beat this one person because it's a gigantic protest movement that swept tons and tons and tons of the country. It was Yanukovych's reaction after being put under pressure that ultimately led to his demise. And so to completely ignore both the coercion, where he allowed the Budapest Memorandum to basically fall apart at the start. And it wasn't that they were protesting about the Budapest Memorandum, but that's what it was, to allow himself to be coerced by the Russians. And then instead of applying pressure to the Russians, he applied pressure to his own people, which then became illegal, which then became brutal, which then became bans of protest, which then were reacted to with more and more vigor until his eventual collapse. They had elections since then. And even if you want to say, oh, that was so illegitimate, it was so illegitimate. Let's say you don't care at all. He can do whatever he wants to his own people. The people can, it doesn't matter. 2022, in 2014, there's a big gap of 8 years there. They weren't going to join NATO in a day. There was no democratic legitimacy crisis. The people had an election and they voted Zelensky. The people in the East voted Zelensky. The people in the West voted largely Zelensky too, but certain regions, Poroshenko. So, I mean, legitimacy? Legitimacy of what? I don't believe that he really cares about it. That's what aggravates me the most, is I don't believe this is like he's been misled. I believe that he thinks he's found like a cute trick to say democracy. Well, actually, you guys don't care about democracy at all. I think that's all it is. I think it's like a cute debate point.
It's our enemies.
Even if I grant you this.
One last thing. The NATO expansion is also, of course, going to be one of the major factors. A few days before the invasion, a demand was made, don't let Ukraine join NATO. That demand was ignored. It's up to them. And then a few days later, the 2022 invasion happened.
It is up to them. Why wouldn't it be up to them? If
they were no closer to NATO then than they were 5 years before it or 5 years before that. So to say that NATO was a contributing factor, as in the fact that there's a defensive alliance that could stop them from invading, yes, because, you know, the uncertainty of intentions and statecraft. But that's not an inciting incident here. And Ukraine was, again, no closer to joining NATO at the day of the invasion than they were 5 years before that or 5 years before that. And again, the reason why I think a lot of this is slimy is to say that the NATO contributed to it, NATO membership and the idea that Ukraine could join NATO, that was a big contributing factor, even though nothing changed. But Putin coming out and saying, Ukraine is an extension of Russia. It can only exist as either an extension of Russia or not at all. He makes a speech about it. He writes essays and publishes essays in advance of the invasion. Nah, that's just a Western propaganda talking point. That's where I think there's a certain amount of sliminess here.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that a country's sovereignty matters?
I think that a country's sovereignty matters to an extent. To an extent. I think
let me ask you a question. If the Colombia protesters, right, the ones who supported Hamas and things were like, you know what, and they're citizens, I'm not talking about the student visas and things like that. The citizens of Colombia were like, you know what, we hate America. We want to be part of Hamas now. We want to join Gaza. So we're going to vote to join Gaza. Do you think that would justify in any way, shape, or form Hamas coming in and attacking America in order to liberate the Colombian protesters?
I don't know if this is the pathway I would go with this, but I see what he's trying to do.
who have
No.
decided that, oh, we want to be part of God.
I think this is so removed from reality that it kind of takes, like saying like, what if Biden did the same thing and hired gangs to suppress protests? That's simple, like boom, boom. But there's so many layers here that I think the point kind of gets lost.
Gaza now.
It's disanalogous, and I'll explain why. A better analogy would be, let's imagine if Canada had an unconstitutional coup that was undemocratic and was against the will of the vote that had just happened, let's say.
When he says just happened, to be clear, that vote was in 2012. So it was 2 years, because it was 2014 that he fell. So when we say just happened, to be clear, that would mean be saying 2026, oh, the election just happened. Well, that can happen. Hell, we can see Trump's approval rating has changed a lot just in, his first 2 to 3 months. So, I mean, just happened is a little, okay, but whatever.
And there were parts of Canada that were thus disenfranchised because, like,
and again, like the thing is, he's trying to isolate certain factors while not painting the whole picture. This is as disanalogous, more disanalogous. If you don't include what incited the guy to flee the country, like what incited the protesters to act that way, the different actions taken by the government, in a certain different set of circumstances, I really believe that we would 180. I think that if Biden did the same things Yanukovych did, this conversation in this room would be entirely different. And that's why I don't think he answered that question last time we talked about it, when I gave that comparison. Okay, if Biden hired gangs and then tried to ban protesting, what then? What should the libertarian do then in reference to the election from 2 years ago?
Countries, certain areas tend to vote for certain candidates more than others. And then on top of that, this new illegal government reached out to Russia and attempted
to be clear, new illegal government, they had elections. They had preceding elections that would follow shortly after.
To join SISTO and attempted to put Russian missiles on the border with the U.S. As a great power, it is myopic to think that the U.S. wouldn't do anything. The tanks are rolling in the next day. We were willing to end the world over the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, despite the fact that we had invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs just a year prior.
To be clear, the new government was offering Russia leases in Crimea to be extended. When they invaded Crimea, because if the problem was nukes on the border, like he's suggesting, oh my God, Americans could put nukes on the border, it wouldn't be an invasion of Crimea. There wouldn't be like a little Donbass war. They would have invaded the entire country and crushed it, because you can still put nukes on the border. It's just the border has been moved. So, I mean, that doesn't really solve the equation. They invaded Crimea, and then it was about the people of Crimea. It became about the military base in Crimea and its importance for their national security in the Black Sea and its history and such. That's what they talked to. I don't buy that, oh, they invaded in 2014 because of the nuclear atomic threat. I think that they certainly didn't want them in NATO, and they wanted to take over Crimea. They wanted to take advantage of the chaos, which they did, even after the Ukrainian government offered to renew the lease, or at least negotiate it.
There are certain lines that great powers, red lines that they have, and one of them is, and Russia's made it clear, Ukraine, for many reasons, is one of the red lines here. They made that clear before the invasion.
And also, what government has suggested that they're willing to place nukes in Ukraine, or has hinted that in any way, or taken any steps towards it? 2014, 2013, 2012, at all. I mean, we have NATO states that don't even have nukes in them. So even if we're talking about NATO, even if they join NATO, that would not necessarily mean we put nukes in them.
And they've made it clear since.
The question I have is, why Ukraine? What about literally any other country?
Well, I
about
do
Burma?
think we should. I do think we should support Taiwan, for example, as another country where I think we should draw red lines, and we should not let imperial powers come in and start.
The good answer would be previous commitments, our integration with Europe, the incentivization of upholding nuclear arms treaties, because if a nation state gives up its nukes, it should be rewarded for that. I don't think that it should be punished for that. I think the more nation states with nukes, the worse it is. I think there's more chances of failure, more chances of an incident. I think that's negative. These are some points you could throw out there. the fact that I don't think the Russians are going to stop at Ukraine if they get the way that they want it to get. I mean, if they get it the way they want to get it, they took over all of Ukraine. I think there's a good chance that they would invade again. And having the largest war in Europe since World War II just constantly reigniting is not only bad for the international economy, it's also bad for world security and food security. And I don't think that the way that we stop these future wars is by punishing the invaded. If anything, I think it would incentivize the invaders to consider it. So I think that by the end of this war, the deal that has to be negotiated is one that is strong for Ukraine and allows it to not be invaded again.
Taking chunks. And the reason why is because it's in our interest. And these are the key words. Ukraine is in our interest because Ukraine is connected to a lot of European countries. We have, Ukraine isn't just the only country that borders Russia. You have Estonia bordering Russia. You have the Balkans, right? And you have, well, now Finland and Sweden and things, but they weren't part of NATO before the invasion. But this matters because the reason why a lot of countries in 2004 joined NATO was because they foresaw this Russian imperial aggression that was coming. They were worried over their sovereignty, and they wanted protection from that. So if we abandon Ukraine, what that does is it sends a signal to our allies that are our actually allies, the NATO allies that we have, that, you know what, if it costs too much, then maybe we're going to abandon them too. And that creates a very dangerous situation.
But Ukraine is not an ally of the United States.
I think it might make more sense. I understand him trying to like belabor this point, but if you listen to how Lactoid talk, it's quick point, quick point, quick point, or Wick is taking his time with the one. I wonder if there would be more usefulness to rapid fire a bit.
Them too, and that creates a very dangerous situation.
But Ukraine is not an ally of the United States.
Ukraine can be, and I think it should be.
When someone says like an ally, we work with them. They went into Iraq with us. Their soldiers died in Iraq. They supported us in Afghanistan. They supported us in many UN votes. They gave up their atomic weapons at our request. I mean, what is an ally? I mean, we have actual allies, if you want to use that, actual allies, people within treaties that didn't go with us into Iraq, like the French. I don't think that we should have invaded Iraq, but I think you see my point about the fact that, yeah, the Ukrainians have worked with us quite tightly, and they want to continue to work with us tightly in the future. And it's not like they have nothing to offer us. So, I mean, in effect, I think that we are, in effect, allies. Whether or not you have it formalized with a certain treaty, I mean, you can say, well, technically we're not allies. Well, we agreed to support them in a certain way. We have agreements that we would like to uphold. They have supported us in certain ways. Word games.
Sure, but that's not what I'm asking.
It's an art.
Because it's not. And so it's understandable what you're saying, that if, say, Lithuania saw an incursion from, Russia brought troops into Belarus, and then, or Kaliningrad started launching incursions through the border of Kaliningrad. Yeah. But Ukraine's not an ally, nor are they a member of NATO, nor the EU. So for what is the reason the U.S. intervened in this regard?
Again, because it's in our interest.
What are those interests?
Sure. One of our interests
the military-industrial complex. That was one of the things he mentioned, is creating American jobs. It's a way that we can...
That is one.
This is one of the reasons why I don't like this point, is it leans into that narrative hard. And again, there's more cost-effective ways to make jobs, but there is a logic to expanding things like artillery and TNT production if we don't know how to, if we can't currently massively expand artillery production in the need of that event and the need of the externality that we needed for interstate conflict. So there is a use for it, and there is a use for the United States for it, and it will produce some jobs. It's just not the most cost-effective way to do it, and they can just lean into this narrative easy. That's why I don't really make the point that often. Actually, I don't think I've ever really made the point. Have I? I try to avoid it because I don't think it's the best point.
On the military-industrial complex.
Absolutely. That is one of our interests, but another of our interests is create stability in this region. Because if Ukraine falls, like we talk about the cost of supporting Ukraine, we got to talk about the cost of not supporting Ukraine. What happens if we abandon Ukraine and Ukraine falls? What happens to our interests? What happens to the cost to American consumers? Trade, we have about $1 trillion, a little less, a year with Europe in trade. And if that is disrupted, right, it just hurts our wealth at home.
What would disrupt that?
So, for example, if Ukraine falls, a lot of our European allies will see us as unreliable. And I'll give you an example of this happening. When Trump canceled, briefly paused the aid that was going to Ukraine, cut off intelligence and things like that, the EU began to question its purchases that it was making from
Did it stop
us
them?
when it comes to us. It has granted them, so the EU has talked about they are no longer going to want to source some of the parts that they get for their munitions and their things from us.
This is true. The Europeans are considering, I mean, look, Rheinmetall stock is going through the roof. I think that their value just went over Volkswagen. Which, I mean, that's saying something for a German defense company. Not to mention the lifting of the debt rules in Germany, and where is that money going to be going? That money, where, I mean, Germany's lifted debt rules. The Germans are buying weapons, and they're going to buy some American weapons just because we dominate the market so much. But there wouldn't be as much of a concern and so much domestic inflow for their domestic production if they thought that they could reliably rely on us. And so instead, they're going to invest that money domestically. Now, honestly, I think it's good. I think it's good for Europe's defense that they invest in their domestic military production. I do think that it will be negative for the American defense industry to lose as much of that purchasing power as the Europeans are going to be investing inward. Whether or not we see that in the short term, I doubt. And the reason I doubt it is they simply don't have the amount of production in order to make up that gap. And they already have so many integrated systems that I think it's going to take time for us to see that that major capital shift. But you can already see those investors on the market reacting to it, with Rheinmetall stock skyrocketing and American defense company stock are going in a different direction.
Because we are no longer reliable. They're setting up, I'm not sure if it's in place yet.
I actually wonder if Trump's recently announced $1 trillion Pentagon budget, after saying a few weeks before he was going to cut it in half, is in some way in relation to Europeans maybe not wanting to purchase. I wonder how much of it is, hey, can we spur growth into defense? I don't know. It could just be to hit the big number in Trump's case. You never really know. It could be a combination. Big number and defense.
But they're setting up a system where they buy from themselves because they realize that, oh, maybe under this regime.
It doesn't sound like that's related to Ukraine, though. It sounds like it's related to Trump's trade issues.
No, this was before the trade issues.
So you're saying that
this is before the trade imports and anything like this. This is when Trump canceled or paused, I should say, the aid we were giving to Ukraine that we had already allocated to give to Ukraine. He paused that so it wasn't coming in. He also canceled the intelligence sharing that we were doing. And again, like, Europe is on this doorstep, and a lot of Europe.
I think honestly, there's the one approach that I put forward about going halfway, like, hey, here's our national state interests and here is the morals, to try to appeal to a large net. I think there might just be like a fire hose approach. If let's come in here and let's not be naive, okay? What happens if we accept the current terms on the table? Let's talk about the reality of the Russians invading again and controlling for the externality. What do we do? Lactoid didn't have an answer for that conversation, really, and he certainly could not control for that externality, and he admits as much. I think, and Wick was there for this conversation. So this is an area that I think Wick should, we're just starting, so we have time, but he really should focus on.
Are our allies, and they see and they're watching how America is going to support them, because by supporting Ukraine, we are supporting them. We are making the world safer for them. And that's a direct benefit. It is not a wild assertion.
They're not an ally. As Tim said, they're not an ally, right? You're saying they could be an ally, and I understand that U.S. aid and several other...
but you understand that, like, Estonia is our ally.
Estonia is our ally. They're a NATO ally.
Right?
And I would agree.
The Netherlands is our ally.
Why would he concede? This is just... And in some way, for example, what if we didn't have a formal alliance with Saudi Arabia, right? And I think there is certain agreements when it comes to defense, but I'd have to go back and check if it would mark as a formal alliance or not. But there are nation states like Egypt or others, but especially when you talk about like nation states like Saudi Arabia. Let me actually Google this. Saudi Arabia, formal ally, America. Mutual assistance agreement. Despite the differences between the countries, two countries have been allies ever since. Okay, so it was Saudi Arabia that had this. Maybe not the best example. Maybe Kuwait's a good example. Kuwait and other countries in the region, through economic ties with the United States and other agreements that are not formal allianceships, have been able to build relationship with the United States where we're working in tandem basically as allies. You know what this feels like to me? In some ways, even though of course there's formal treaty allies and there's other types of allies, I think we can acknowledge that. I don't know why we're trying to make it black and white. This feels like, I remember I had a debate with Jackson Hinkle a long time ago on Taiwan, and I was arguing that Taiwan is an American ally. And, you know, we should support Taiwan in order to preserve the status quo and avoid a major war, et cetera, et cetera. And he refused to acknowledge Taiwan as a country and I said, okay, what things does Taiwan not have that doesn't make it a country? And one thing he says, it doesn't have an embassy. And I said, what about this that functions as an embassy? It's just called different. It's like the Taiwan, I forget what it's called, but it's like the Taiwan Association or like the Taiwan American Embassy. It's a different like business name. The American Institute in Taiwan. That's what it's called. The American Institute in Taiwan. It's the same thing. It's just a private institution because we don't have a formal embassy, but it does all the same work. So in effect, if they have a currency, if all these other things, they're in effect a country. If we have these things, then we're in effect an ally. And now if we want to play like word games, we can play word games. But I mean, we have agreed to support them till the end. We've made written agreements about their defense in the event of something like this happening. They've supported us in our wars.
For sure.
France is our ally,
and
correct?
They're covered under
They are
Article
all
5.
wanting us. They are all wanting us to support Ukraine.
Well, I'm sure they are. That's less money that they have to spend. I'm sure they all want us to
They're all
give-
ramping up
I'm
their
sure-
money.
Good.
What are you talking about?
Hold on,
They
hold
are
on.
ramping up their money and spending.
I don't control their money, okay? If they want to spend money, I can't stop. I don't think it's a good idea, but I can't stop them. But if you're saying, oh, they want us to spend this money, I'm sure they do, right? I don't think that we should. Not only for the reasons that I outlined before, but because you're openly talking about, well, it's in our interest because of the military industrial complex.
And our interest makes Americans safer, and it makes the world safer.
No, it's in our interest.
American hegemony has made the world a safer place.
Ukraine,
a better place.
You really
The problem I have with Wick's argumentation here is you don't need to argue in favor of American hegemony to argue in favor of support for Ukraine. You can argue in favor of a bipolar, multipolar, whatever world order you really want to, and still say in a multipolar world, it would still be better to support Ukraine. But by attaching yourself to American hegemony, right, which you can and cannot debate in probably a different venue, but by attaching yourself to it, definitely in an environment like this, like they're just gonna take you for pot shots. I feel like you're opening yourself up for pot shots at least. And I don't know if Wick can get in that conversation and defend that. If he has the foreign policy knowledge to do that and have that conversation. If he does, good luck. But it's a lot easier to defend just supporting Ukraine than it is to defend American hegemony as a whole. You know, it feels like, and the way now this isn't true in all debates, right? But in a conversation like this, where you're going on a platform where, you know, the foundations may be a little crooked and you're going to be debating somebody who's slippery, to say the least, you know, a little slips around. You want to pick a good trench. You want to pick a good foxhole, something that's deep, like 8 feet down, 6 feet down. You know, you got good wood walls. Then, you know, something that might be closer or further or more radical position, but you've got a worse entrenchment. I prefer the former than the latter because I think that you should focus on what's the easiest to defend a position in an environment like this, not reach out towards all of American hegemony.
really think
Not just for America,
do you really
but
think
for the world.
Ukraine was more stable or less stable after? Do you think it was more stable, or sorry? Do you think
Do you think it was
Ukraine
more stable or less stable after Russia invaded? I think it was less stable.
Hold on. Do you think Ukraine was more stable after 2014 than before?
Of course not.
Okay.
What's the what? Okay.
What happened in 2014?
In 2014, Russia.
This is what we're doing now. This is what we're doing. We're back to the Euromite. Oh boy. If you guys want to look, I'll try to blaze through this. If you guys want to see me confront him on this framing, I debated him directly on Wick's program. You can go back and watch that. He doesn't know what led to 2014 in the first place with the economic coercion. Maybe he's learned since then. He could have. He probably prepared himself before going on Tim's show, but I doubt it.
Sent little green men into Crimea.
What happened before
right?
then?
They locked down, right? They locked down the parliament so no one can get in. Men with guns, right?
What happened before then?
They forced a vote.
What happened before then?
If you had the right person in that seat, they could flip this on Lactoid easy and go further and further back to the very start of it, which, again, he has a lack of knowledge. Wick was there for that conversation. Wick was there for that convo. He hosted it.
Let me read the exact resolution here. That's why I took some notes.
I'm sorry.
UN Resolution 68262, right? The invalid referendum on 16th of March 2014, where Crimea declared its independence and joined Russia. This was obviously
Why'd you put that in why'd you put that in scare quotes?
Because it was, again, as the UN resolution says, invalid.
You're saying it's
we
invalid.
We recognize it's invalid.
I'm asking you why was it invalid?
It was done under duress.
Was it?
Because Russians sent their little green men in. They brought guns.
Is Lactoid really like questioning the legitimacy of what happened in Crimea as like it could have been a legitimate referendum, or is this just the point? Well, that's not legitimate. Neither was Euromaidan. Why are we arguing about? Okay, it's not that having this conversation's bad in and of itself. You can have like a short, brief, like you can go over here before getting back to modern day to give people a background. It's just Lactoid is the worst person I would choose to explain this, and I don't think Wick is equipped to go through the Euromaidan timeline. Maybe he'll surprise me, but I mean, I don't think so. We'll see.
They locked down the parliament. They forced a vote.
What's little green?
He's remembering the post Crimea invasion, but pre Crimea invasion.
Green men.
Little green men. So
and I don't even necessarily blame him for not knowing the whole timeline. But I mean, if you're going to get into these specifics, you got to out specific Lactoid.
Green uniforms. They rip off their badge, right? So they're not actually Russian soldiers, and they go in and they do their thing, and they have some plausible deniability, which people like my comrade Lactoid here will say, oh, that's obviously not the Russians, it's just some paramilitary.
Well, I want to educate Wick a little bit on this. So obviously there were Russians there. I'm not denying that the little green men were Russians, obviously.
Russian soldiers, to be
yes,
clear.
Of course, from Sevastopol, for sure.
With guns that were threatening force.
Yep.
Okay.
But when I asked you before, what happened before then, I think it's telling that you're just ignoring all the context, as is usual with this conversation.
There's no one funnier than can say this, the Lactoid. He didn't know what started it. How can you, like, we need to go back to Euromaidan, and he doesn't know what started Euromaidan. He doesn't know that Russia cut off trade at the border and economically coerced him, which was in violation of the Budapest Memorandum. Violating the Budapest Memorandum in 2013. That's not even, go back to the early 2000s. You can talk about the island crisis in southern Crimea and the building of the bridge, which could have been seen as a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty then as well. He doesn't know how it started. So it aggravates me to hear, because there's a type of presentable snobbiness and there's a type of like outrage snobbiness. There's a type of like, oh, this is the presentable snobbiness. Like, let me educate you on this. I mean, I don't know, man. Just because you got to the end of the Wikipedia page, whatever.
Before you cut me off again, that is usual. This conversation, there's it just happened, right? There's this it just came out of the sky. This invasion just came out of the sky. When in reality, what happened is Crimea had for years wanted to leave Ukraine. In fact, in
that's not true.
1992, they declared independence. Ukraine said, you better nullify that within a week with the threat of force. So then they were like, okay, fine, we're not gonna leave. And
just
then,
like Chechnya, that's Russia did.
We can talk about Chechnya in a second, because I also know about Chechnya.
Not a good argument, Wick, because then you could say, I thought you didn't like what happened in Chechnya. I think that's okay in Crimea.
But then
they had a vote to leave Ukraine, to leave the Soviet Union, and then they had a vote that made them join Ukraine. They voted like 54%. But I mean, when they invaded in 2014, I don't know what we're talking about, 1992. Like, and by the way, right, if we were to go back to then, by 93, they had the vote to join. It doesn't matter, though. It happened in 2014. That's when the Russians invaded and took over Crimea. The last polling data that we can access from the United Nations indicates that it's about a wash, that there's a certain amount of the population that wants to, and I think it was like a plurality was in favor of either Crimea being independent or part of it was independence. There was Ukraine, there was Russia. There was no majority that wanted to be part of Russia. There was not a majority that wanted to be part of Ukraine either. They kind of balance each other out, and then the people in the middle wanted to be independent. That's a situation that shouldn't be changed by force. And mind you, this is after, if we're going to talk about, like, for example, U.S. aid and all of these nefarious, horrible things we did in Ukraine, the Russians were engaging in a lot of propaganda campaigns in Crimea in order to have that effect of getting just to that, rate of like maybe 20 to 25 to 30% of the population being open to the idea of being annexed by Russia. But it was never a majority. And something like that, moving from one country, changing your passports, dividing families, this is something that needs to be developed through consensus, not through invasion. If you want to talk about legitimacy.
Yeah, and then in 2014,
how did Russia treat them?
In 2010, there was a president elected in Ukraine, Yanukovych. And in 2014, he was, do you deny that he was...
I thought it was 2012. When was it 2010 presidential election? But he just said they had an election right before. If it's 2010, then it's 4 years before. That's even less than before. Presidential election, Ukraine. Yeah, it was 2010. I thought it was 2012. Or was I thinking about a parliamentary election? Let me check. Yes, I was thinking about the parliamentary elections. That's what I was thinking about. Yes. But if we're talking about that, and he said it happened right before, that's 4 years. That's not right before. That's the same gap between an American election. A lot can happen in 4 years. That's more than a lifetime in politics.
Unconstitutionally couped?
No, but that doesn't matter.
Why doesn't it matter?
That doesn't matter.
Why doesn't the votes of Crimeans matter?
Why doesn't the votes of Crimeans matter? They didn't get a vote to be part of Russia. By the way, let's say you voted for Yanukovych, okay? Because I've met people who voted for Yanukovych. Just because you voted for Yanukovych does not mean that you want to be part of Russia. I don't know whether, hey, I voted for Yanukovych. Oh no, after he hired these gangs, horrible brutalization, he's fled the country. I guess that means I vote to be Russia now. That's not how that works. Could you imagine that we have some crisis in the United States? We're like, oh my gosh, can you believe it? Donald Trump is being challenged. Oh, Canada's taking New Hampshire. Like, that's, even if they voted for Harris up there, they didn't say they wanted to be Canadian.
Them being disenfranchised matter.
It doesn't give Russia the right to come in with guns, tanks, and materiel and force the issue. Russia or any other nation does not have the right to come in with force and violate someone's sovereignty
just gotta sit and take it?
To solve an internecine conflict. There are other ways to deal with that.
What way?
Russia did this
what way should
with
Crimea,
military force.
What way should Crimea have handled it?
Any other way but this.
What way?
Because Crimea didn't handle it, Russia did.
What way?
Russia took away their choice.
How should Russia have handled it was the question?
To solve an internecine conflict. There are other ways to deal with that.
What way?
Russia did this.
What way should Crimea
military force.
What way should Crimea have handled it?
Any other way but this.
What way?
Because Crimea didn't handle it.
The way it should have been handled is not invasion after the Euromaidan. They could have negotiated a continuation of the lease, not divided families. I'm sure the United States was terrified of a Russian invasion. They wanted the Ukrainian protesters to make a deal with Yanukovych. Many of them refused, kind of, counteracting the idea that this was all incited by the United States and, this was all them doing, they had their own interests because they're their own nation state, as we're seeing right now with the Ukrainians bucking with the Trump administration as they try to get them to do things that they don't want to do.
Russia did.
What way?
Russia took away their...
I don't know why that, okay. But they could have handled it through just asking for a renewal of the lease. They could have demanded a new election, including all of the Eastern European regions. The West was terrified of Russia invading. That's why they wanted them to take the deal. So what was Russia supposed to think? Oh, America's going to invade now? They were terrified.
A curd is a curd.
They gave every indication that they didn't want a war.
How many cans can a canner can if a canner can cans? A
And they all-
canner can as many cans as a canner can. If a canner can cans.
Thank you for the $5. Point is, like, they can't. It's one thing to say something along the lines of like, what Russia is uncomfortable by the uncertainty of alliances like NATO, considering its historical roots. It's another thing to suggest that, hey, what else could Russia have done in a situation like that? Like anything else? Negotiated a lease renewal and then told the West that they need to have immediate new elections, including these regions, and it could have been monitored by international organizations. I mean, the Ukrainians were willing to do just about anything to stop a full-scale invasion. And they got a Crimea invasion, they got an invasion of the Donbass, but they could have done a lot. Really, let's not negotiate. Is this what we're debating? Could the Russians have done anything else? Yeah, they could have done a lot else.
Choice.
Why did Russia go into Crimea?
Because it's been part of their plan. They want Ukraine. Putin's wanted Ukraine for a while.
But why Crimea?
Crimea had pronunciation's hard.
Again, it's Sevastopol, but this doesn't make his arguments any less valid. But it's hostile territory.
There's ports in there that gives them access to what they call warm water ports, right? Because they don't have a lot of those.
Even though nobody on this network can complain about that.
It gives them access, and they can use their navies and things like that.
It's the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and their only warm water port.
And they're primarily Russians in Crimea as well.
But that wasn't under threat, right?
Of course it was.
Let me say there's primarily Russians in Crimea. Now in 2024, 2025 now, there's primarily Russians in Crimea. They were Ukrainians. What do you mean? They were Russian speakers? Is that what he means? What does he mean they were primarily there were people with Russian ancestry? But when he says that, he needs to be specific. When he says, "Oh, they're primarily Russians," do you mean Russian speakers? Do you mean people that are ethnic, like they were people who settled over here as Russia? Did those people want to be? All of those people want to be part of Russia?
What was the threat?
Because
they had a lease.
Yeah, I'll explain to you why it was under threat. Okay, it was under threat for a couple reasons. But when you have the pro-Russian president get unconstitutionally couped in 2014, and now you have this country which prior had promised to not join military blocs, is now looking towards NATO, right? There is a concern that if they join NATO, that you're saying that, but that's. How do you, as a geopolitical actor, how do you know that for sure? Especially when you have
I need more than just a.
You don't know that for sure. Because Hungary says no, Turkey says no, the United States says no, France, Germany, basically every single major player said no to the idea of Ukraine joining NATO back in 2014. There was a few, definitely Eastern Europeans, maybe we should be a little different, but that was the wide consensus. And certainly after the Russian invasion in 2014. And that had not changed by the time 2022 had rolled around in any manner. There was some further integration, but I mean, we weren't sending massive amounts of weapons. It was all happening at a snail's pace. There was a lot of other options on the table besides, I guess we got to invade.
Possibility. I need reasonable.
You had a coup. You had a coup. How can you trust this new government when they ignore
you negotiate with them?
Their own constitution? They ignored Article 108.
I'm sorry. I love this. The Ukrainians ignored their constitution. How can the Russians trust them? I don't know. Come on, man. The Russians ignore their constitution all the time. They wipe their ass with their constitution. Their constitution is like a paper airplane. They go wow in the Duma. What do you mean? The constitution. How could the Russians trust them when they violated the constitution? Name me a strong ally of Vladimir Putin who hasn't violated the constitution.
They ignored Article 111.
As if that was something that they could negotiate with new coup governments all the time. We do it in Afghanistan with the Taliban. We do it with all sorts of governments all around the world. Oh, they couldn't negotiate with them because how could they trust them? You could try. They didn't even try.
And they disenfranchised millions of people, millions of Crimeans. And by the way, the UN...
Again, if it wasn't for the invasion, they would have had another vote. Through the Russian invasion, you want to know what happened? There's no more civil society in Crimea. You're not allowed to protest the government. You're not allowed to critique the government. You're not really allowed to speak Ukrainian if you don't want to visit. You have to carry a Russian passport. You have to identify as a Russian citizen. You have to be pretty aggressively in support of the invasion. There's no civil society that exists in Ukraine. Oh, the legitimacy of the people being deemed. There's no civil society there. There's no democracy there. There's no real elections there. And so when we talk about the disfranchisement of the Crimean people, they've been disenfranchised ever since the Russians occupied the territory. Name me one legitimate election that happened there under Lactoid's, I guess, high standards for legitimacy. I don't buy it, man. I just don't buy this is coming from a genuine place.
Had done polling in Crimea prior to this and found that most Crimeans would vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia. This
is a lie.
Between 2000.
I'm just gonna throw it's a lie. And you know what? Let's go explore the wonderful lands of Wikipedia, okay? We're gonna use the last poll, okay? We're going to use the last poll before they got invaded. That was because that would be the most up-to-date one before it's like, hey, what's your opinion? I think that's fair. So we'll use the last one. Where is it? Here we go. So here is the last poll. If you want to know where this data comes from, I believe this is UN data. Was this UN data? Or am I looking at a different one that was UN data? The International Republican Institute in May 23rd. No, that's a separate one. I believe this is UN data. Report on monitoring social economic status. Yes, United Nations. So, UN, okay? The United Nations. So these are not pro-Ukrainian nationalists or whatever. The United Nations. 41% become part of the Russian Federation. 11% independent state. Now, people see this and they think, oh, okay, well, then that clearly shows. Well, that's not a majority. So it's already a lie. Okay? Not a majority. He said majority. Not, hey, if you take the one single poll answer and no, he said majority. Now you go over to Ukraine. Stay in Ukraine with greater autonomy, 20%. Stay in Ukraine with same level of autonomy, 13%. Become a normal region of Ukraine. That means decrease your autonomy, 6%. Become a region under the direct control of the president. So these are people who are like, we need to actually crack down. That's 2%. So 2% plus 6%, that's 8%. Then you plus the 12% there, 12.4, 12.5. Then you're at what with that? 20%, 20-something percent. Then you add 19.1. And you know what you're at? You're getting near 40%. You're at 40%. So 40% says stay in Ukraine of different varieties, and 41% says become part of the Russian Federation, with 11% in the middle, independent state. You want to know what that's within? The margin of error. It's not true that the majority of Ukrainians and look, I'm going off of UN data. You can go for this private institute there, whatever you want to do. There's other polls here. A poll by the International Republican Institute of May 2013 find that 53% autonomy in Ukraine as today. That means keep the status quo because they still wanted to visit their families in Ukraine. They wanted to keep it as it was. 12% were for more Crimean Tatar autonomy within Ukraine. 2% for common oblast. 23% says Crimea should be separated and given to Russia. Now, this is the International Republican Institute. That's not why I led with these much better numbers. Or, for example, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. Now, I respect the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. I think they do good polling data. I've checked their methodology. I think this polling data is generally accurate. But here's the UN data. So if you go off the data that I think we should have the least argumentation with, the UN data, it's basically matched. 40 to 41% within the margin of error with 11% in the middle. It's not true that the majority wants to be part of Russia. The polling indication on that is not clear.
We'll never know for sure if they would.
Research
the vote they had, vote they had was conducted under coercive force.
I'm almost done.
See, this is the thing. What we're doing now, from this point forward, is just going to be going off of polling data that I don't think Wick has looked into. If Wick was able to Google this quick and look at Wiki, just Wikipedia, you can say, wait, your polling says that, this polling says this, because there's different polls that say different things. But I go off the UN data because it's the United Nations, and I would assume that they wouldn't have an interest And in the way they ask the question too, it makes it look like Russia has a larger portion than it does before you combine all the Ukrainian ones into one. You give a lot more selection on the Ukrainian side.
I think less than 2 months following the annexation of Crimea into Russia, Pew Research went in and did a poll, and 88% of Crimeans said that Kiev should recognize the results.
So 2 months, a bunch of people left. A bunch of people didn't participate in the election. And a lot of people are not going to raise their voice in an environment where people's bodies were ending up bloated down the river. Like, we had polling from before the Russians annexed it. Why would we use the data after? And he already misquoted the data from before.
Only 4% said no, which is relatively in line with what the referendum was.
They were
So he's trying to legitimately argue that the referendum that the Russians did was more accurate than the UN data. Let's just be clear of that. Lactoid trusts Russian referendums over UN data. This is the caliber of conversations we're having.
occupied by Russian forces.
Okay, so
you don't say no.
When they weren't occupied, they wanted to leave Ukraine and join Russia. What about that?
Through a poll.
Through a UN poll.
Isn't a vote.
What do you mean through a UN poll? You know what he did? This fucking moron. This fucking moron. Can I tap out now? This might be where I tap out. This dumbass lactoid went to Wikipedia, was like, let's look at the polling. 41% compared to 20. Woo-hoo-hoo. Wow, oh my God, I guess all of the Ukrainians really do what? Number one, it's still not a majority, what she indicated. So even if she misconstrued the numbers, it would still be a lie. But all you had to do was add up these numbers and they become equal. That's all you had to do. He read the same numbers we did and then still lied about it. It's the first thing that shows up on Wikipedia. By the way, Tim Pool could check this live. He could, he has people on staff. He could pull it up. He's hosting it.
UN, because Ukraine wouldn't let them have a vote. They tried to have a vote in 1992, and Ukraine said no.
More than just someone calling you up on the phone, like, "Hey, buddy, do you want to secede from your country?" You need an actual constitutional Congress. You need something actual.
Would Ukraine let them have that vote?
At the end of the day,
yeah.
At the end of the day, none of this justifies Russia.
Wait, by the way, whether or not Ukraine would, depending on which government's in power, allow Crimea to have a vote on whether they would be independent does not change the data of whether or not, before the Russians invaded, the majority of the population wanted to be part of Russia. That doesn't change anything. It could change, like, well, it's not fair that, maybe it's not fair that the Ukrainians would think that, but name me a nation state that would willingly, just by the stroke of a pen because it looked at some polling data, say, sure, we give up that land. Especially when it's as useful as Crimea. I'm just saying no government in the world would do that.
Coming in.
Of course it does.
And of course
it'd be one thing if Russia was like, let's negotiate like, special protection for the Russian language in Crimea. They still wouldn't have a legit, it still wouldn't be good to leverage military force for objectives like that. They could try that. There's so many other avenues they could have tried, probably with more effect in Ukraine and keeping their positive image than invading and conquering, because a certain portion of the population, which Lactoid says was a majority, but the polling data he cites says otherwise, wants to be part of Russia.
Does not. We would never let that happen in any other situation.
Ukraine
Russia
let them vote.
did not let that happen.
No,
when Chechnya tried to secede, right? And when the Warsaw Pact broke apart, when the USSR broke apart, and Chechnya said, okay, we want to go away too. At the time, they were like, no way, Jose. And they came in with military force.
So you support that?
Stomped them down. I absolutely
You know what sucks too? I told Lactoid to his face this polling data was wrong our last conversation. And he continues to repeat it. And Wick was there. This is the thing. Look, Wick's doing as good as he can with, I think, in the situation he's in. But some of these aggravate me because I remember Wick was there moderating the debate where I said, hey, dude, look at the data you just cited. That's not accurate. Like, if he asked Tim Pool to pull up the data and he read it out right now, that would disprove Lactoid. That's, come on, Wick.
Do not, because of the way they handled that.
Whoa, why don't you support
Because
that?
of the, again, as if you listen to that, because of the way they handled that.
What way did they handle it then?
Gross human violations of their rights.
The Ukrainians do that in the Donbass?
No.
No. So
No.
when Amnesty
You know
says
why?
when Amnesty says that they were committing war crimes by firing unguided rockets in civilian areas, that's just thousands of people dead. Who cares?
So the oh, go ahead.
Amnesty International did not say that the Ukrainian army, by firing unguided munitions, had killed thousands of civilians. That's not what they had said. They had said that during the Donbass war, both Russian and Ukrainian armies had fired a lot of unguided munitions, which hit a lot of civilian areas. This was something that happened on both sides. Now, there's a question of scale and how much, but I mean, how is that? Russia invaded, and then they bombed civilian areas, Ukraine bombed civilian areas. That's not anything more at the feet of Ukraine than it is at the feet of Russia. You could say the same thing during our fighting in Europe. You could talk about conduct and the need to improve the conduct of war, but that has nothing to do with the legitimacy of Russia's claims in the Donbass. If it did, then, I mean, Russia's operation to protect the Donbass has been a total failure because a lot of the cities are no longer even standing.
You brought up the vote from Crimea, and so I've been looking into it. I have a question for you. In the 2010 election in Ukraine, which you mentioned,
Yes.
Viktor Yanukovych won 49.55% against Yulia Tymoshenko, who won 46.03%.
Yes.
So a 3% difference is what justifies a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Even though Yanukovych's campaign message was never, let's be part of Russia now, we're all Russia. That wasn't his campaign message. He appealed to being Russian sympathetic as a brother country, all that stuff. But when he did like national addresses, he tried to speak in kind of a choppy, not the best Ukrainian in order to try to appeal to those people to say like, see, I'm still Ukrainian. We're not Russia. He tried to argue against the idea that he was a Russian puppet. So is it impossible for us to think that there were some people who said, I'm going to vote for him because, of the type of mercantilist politics that goes on in Eastern Ukraine. And I agree with his conservatism on X, Y, and Z more. And I think it'd be good for good business relationship with Russia. That doesn't necessarily just equate into, okay, now that Yanukovych has been overthrown, we're now part of Russia. That does not equate that.
The country was split from the east to the west, with the west largely, and this includes Kiev, largely being in favor of Tymoshenko.
And mind you, there have been elections since this. There have been other elections since the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has drastically changed Ukrainian politics.
And the right being
in both Western and Eastern Ukraine.
Favor of Yanukovych. Yanukovych had his political opposition after this arrested and held for 3 years in prison.
Following 2010?
Yes.
In 2011, Yulia Tymoshenko was arrested for what is largely seen as political persecution and held.
See what I mean? Even I'm sorry. This is horrible. This is I don't talk about Yulia because I think she's kind of goofy. Okay, I think she's kind of goofy. A lot of her beliefs are pretty goofy. And when I say goofy, I mean, ugh. But yeah, that happened. I'm sorry that you're just finding out about this, Lactoid, but Yanukovych was a notoriously corrupt man. He went from stealing hats off of street racks to wider office through mercantilist politics. Like this is not what you would call a dedicated liberal.
Held for 3 years until Yanukovych was ousted.
Sure. And so,
and not to mention,
and hold on.
during Euromaidan, right?
Okay,
the brutalities that Yanukovych was perpetrated on his people. 108 protesters killed brutally.
And 13 cops were killed. So in terms of the political, oppression that came.
Strong libertarian values emanate from this man at every second of every day. All I feel is liberty.
Following Yanukovych's election. I'm sure there's criticisms you can levy. I know Yanukovych had issues with corruption. I know that, in fact, Ukraine now has issues with corruption.
The question he just brought up wasn't about corruption. It was about arresting the people who are your opponents. That was the question. Which, I mean, like, this was supposed to be like, you guys raided Trump's Mar-a-Lago. This is, come on. And it's not comparable. I'm just saying, like, seems the standards are a little different.
But just because there are those issues doesn't mean that you can trample upon your own constitution to remove a president and not expect separatism in the places, as you brought up, in the places that overwhelmingly voted for Yanukovych. In Crimea and the Donbass, it was overwhelmingly pro-Yanukovych. Do their votes not matter?
Okay, to be clear, he just said it was overwhelmingly pro-Yanukovych. It was pro-Yanukovych. What were the margins in Crimea? 49 to 46. Landslide! Is a 3-vote, let me ask you this question. If in 2028, the Democrats got within 3 points of winning in Mississippi, would we say, like, overwhelming Republican victory in Mississippi? I don't know, man. That's not how I would indicate it. But yeah, he had more support in Eastern Ukraine. That is certain. And his belief about how Ukraine should have its relationship with Russia certainly affected that. But the idea that, and yes, if you were a Yanukovych supporter, the odds that you were a separatist does go up, but it does not, one does not equal the other. You know what most Ukrainians, I think, genuinely wanted in 2014? For there to be a negotiation, for there to be new elections, and for there to be peace. That's not the outcome we had, and the peace was ended when troops crossed the border.
Do you just get to replace this president
Let me
in
ask you this,
2014
Lactoid.
with somebody that was not democratically elected, ignore your own constitution?
They would have elections. They would go on to have elections. They had an interim government, which then had elections. This would make sense if this was like Sudan. If we're talking about Sudan and we said, hey, the Blue Revolution, and then after the Blue Revolution, the army and Hemedti, they got together and the army, never mind. Now they got rid of the transition council. Now they want to hold. That's not what happened. There was a transition government, and then they had an election. Poroshenko won that election, and then Poroshenko lost his next one and was replaced by Zelensky after a peaceful transfer of power that international poll watcher says was a free and fair election where the results polled at the stations matched the results that were indicated at the voting booth.
This is what led to the separatism, and the separatism and this new power structure in Ukraine, and this new power structure and separatism is what led to the 2022 invasion.
Well, let me say new power structure. What does that mean? Because that indicates that, like, what happened is we came in the government and then everything in Ukraine changed. They took the constitution and they just like, we can now do whatever to Russian speakers. And when he said change this, how did the system change? The interim government did not have that much authority to change much of anything. It's part of the reason why there's still so many problems. Not to say that those in the interim government were the ones with all the solutions.
Let me ask you this. Had the U.S. backed and really wanted, right, Yanukovych, political enemy that he jailed for 3 years unconstitutionally, right? If he had wanted, if we
Well, you don't know the
really,
details
really
about
wanted,
that, and you don't either.
If he had really wanted, and I'll go with the hypothetical that what Tim just said was accurate and that was seen and pretty much seen as shady, is illegal, etc. So go with it. Run with me on this. Would that give us, the U.S., the right to go in with gun, tanks, men, and occupy and seek to annex parts of Ukraine? Would that have given us the right to do that? I don't believe you. I don't believe you if you say that you think that we would have that.
I think we've talked about matters of scale.
Matters of scale.
Yeah, no, for sure. Let me explain. In the event that the Constitution was violated, which we don't know if it was, I mean, we had an arrest warrant for Yanukovych.
You see how I was like, the Constitution, when it comes to the protests, sacrosanct. Those people who voted 4 years ago all believe the sacrosanct. Well, rest your political opponents. I mean, how much do we really know about this? Okay, and like, I mean, you know, it's not as bad when you think of it's
issued in 2014, immediately after he left the country. You do have a history.
Fled the country, yes.
He left, yeah, you can say he fled. It's because his car was shot at. If there's a constitutional issue with that, you can say there's major issues.
He fled the country because he overstayed his welcome, but he didn't have the support he had in the capital anymore, which is where, you know, the government is.
You can, in fact, even potentially, if it's bad enough, if there's enough repression, that could potentially justify an invasion based on humanitarian reasons. There is, unless you want to say,
look,
well, hold on. Unless you want to say,
I'll say this.
Hold on a second. Unless you want to say, well, we can't invade a country even if, like, there's gross humanitarian violations, and then that means
you know what sucks is, like, at the start of this, he just said Ukraine's losing. And then we moved on to this conversation. And so that's just taken as a matter of fact for the framing of the rest of this as we go back to 2014 to talk the specifics of what Wick can't remember from the last conversation or to challenge his data that Tim could easily pull up. This is again. I don't think that Wick isn't trying. It's just a problem of like you've got to make up a lot of ground in a short time of preparing for a debate like this. And if you don't know the specifics, then you can't really debate over it.
Invading Nazi Germany is out of the question, the Confederate South.
What I'm saying.
So you can, if there's enough violations of the Constitution and human rights that could justify potentially humanitarian intervention.
Human rights.
But what I'm saying is this, Euromaidan was particularly egregious. We have a movement that, according to the last poll prior to the ousting of Yanukovych, had about 45% popularity and 48% unpopularity, primarily in the East. And you had the president removed, violating Article 108 and Article 111. And
To be clear, he fled the country. And when we talk about this polling data, I don't want to go and check more polling data, but the polling changed as the war went on and new actions were taken, like, for example, banning protest and for the bodies that were ending up down on the street, right? So, I mean, yeah, there's a certain amount of, you could say, I don't think everybody in Eastern Ukraine was a fan of this, but I mean, whether or not, even, let's say it was 50-50 as he indicates, that still doesn't give him a right to treat us that 50% like that. If Trump still had 48% support in America but 45% opposition, and then he went out there and he banned protests, did this, did that, the polling at that point, which I won't even dispute because we've already talked about how Lactoid uses polling data, but even not disputing it, that doesn't necessarily change the legitimacy. If you brutalize a certain part of the population, and then you try to ban their ability to organize and participate in civil society, then what options are you providing them?
And you
Once again,
had
that does not
separatism.
justify.
Well, to some extent, it does. The United States. The United States had help from France. We had a general
Look at what
Lafayette
has happened
come in to help us
after
leave
this.
the UK. Let me ask you this: does the U.S. because
Did he just? What is he comparing to Lafayette? What is? That kind of came out of
we
nowhere.
argued no taxation without representation, and I think nullifying your vote is essentially removing representation. Did the U.S. have a right to leave the UK, the England? Do we have a right to declare independence?
Sure, they were doing more than just that. They were disappearing people. They were giving people no trial. They were just taking them off the street, right? But here's the
In the UK, I mean, a little. I don't know. We had a legal system, but they whatever. I don't want to get into. We're diverting so far away from the conversation. I don't want to get back to the American Revolution and the specifics of our grievances. Okay, Stars and Stripes forever, I guess.
live in 1700s anymore, and we're dealing in a world that is fundamentally different than back then. And to pretend that we're going to live by the same rules that we did back in 1700, I think is folly. Look, none of this justifies. None of this justifies. And this is a principle, right? That a country's sovereignty matters, and a foreign entity cannot use military force in order to violate.
By the way, when we say about Ukraine being more stable after Euromaidan, which was something that, Lactoid made that point to say, see, after Euromaidan, everything got worse. Yeah, because Russia invaded, because they didn't bow to their coercion during Euromaidan. But what about other parts of Ukrainian society after Euromaidan? Corruption is better. It's not gone, but it's certainly improved. Ask anybody what it was like interacting with a police officer back in the early 2000s versus interacting with the Ukrainian police officer today. Ask anybody who had to, for example, try to file for a business. Or the public bidding on contracts, which has helped the Ukrainian government save billions upon billions of dollars. Yeah, the country as a whole, due to the invasions, is less stable, but the country's also made some marquee improvements. Of course, the people want more. They always desire for their society to improve and for them to pass a country that's better for their kids than it was for them. But I mean, if you just say stability in the regions that are occupied and use that as your only indicator, I mean, in 2013, it was not stable. The situation was very unstable in 2013 due to the actions of the government. In comparison to then, I mean, it feels more stable. The country is united and at least its goal. I guess it depends on your definition of stability.
Another country's sovereignty in order to solve a crisis that they themselves have helped serve up. Because if I may finish, Russia has a habit of doing this. Russia has done this before. They did it in Georgia. They took an internecine conflict that was in South Ossetia and I can't pronounce. Oh, Abkhazia. Abkhazia. Thank you. And they pumped money into them. They sent their little green men in there again, their little Russian soldiers, and they stirred up this conflict. Again, remarkably similar to how they behaved in Ukraine with the Donbass and with Crimea and these things. And they use this as an excuse, right, to go in with military force and take a slice, right? And today, even today, they occupy illegally 20% of Georgians' sovereign territory. Russia, and Putin specifically, continues to do this, and they play this game. So this idea that if we just stop funding Ukraine, it's not our problem, he's just going to stop, has not been borne out by the facts of the matter. If someone continues to exhibit a habit of behavior over and over and over again, what is different this time? Let me ask you this, Simon.
You listed 2 times. That's less than the U.S. has intervened in other countries. We invaded Iraq. We invaded Afghanistan. We got involved in Libya.
We
got
didn't
involved
annex
in
Afghanistan. We didn't annex
No, we replaced
Iraq.
the government.
But that's a fundamentally
To a
different thing.
pro-weapon.
Okay. 9/11. I feel like we were attacked on 9/11, and then the Taliban harbored the people who did that. And then a war came from that. Whether or not maybe if we negotiated a little longer, whatever. You can negotiate the specifics of the history. There is no 9/11 equivalent. It's not a comparable war. It's not. Especially since, like, the ideology behind the war, the idea that the Russians never said the Afghans are just like brother Russians. That was never they're just like the Russians of this area, That was not something that they came forward and said when they invaded Afghanistan, or we invaded and said Afghans are actually just Americans and Afghanistan has always been a historical clade of American soil. Not comparable.
Burns
It's just the
is
most
an
recent war, so they have
immoral,
to compare it
morally
because
corrupt,
that's how
bankrupt
you get
man.
like populist drivel. I mean, that's what it is. To compare these types of wars, these wars were unpopular, so you compare them to them, even if they're not really that comparable. It's an appeal to another war's popularity and trying to tie it to this invasion. And wars are bad; they're unpopular by definition. But obviously, more people see Ukraine, Afghanistan as a failure, so they want to attach that failure to Ukraine.
Western government.
And again, I'm not here to support every single thing that the United States has done.
And I'm not here to support
And he shouldn't have come out at the start with the American hegemony thing. If you open up with that, I don't know they're going to bring it there, aren't they?
I'm not here to support every single thing the Russian
Again, you don't need to support every single thing America did to support American hegemony, but again, more defensible positions further back.
government has done. You can point out, and by the way, I'm actually critical of the Russian government when it comes to Chechnya. I think it's surprising that you're not, or that you are, sorry. I think it's surprising that you are critical
I was about to say, do you not
of the
think
Russian government in Chechnya, because the same arguments.
genocide, man.
Well, it's not, no, it wasn't a genocide. But it was an annexation of a area that wanted self-determination, wanted to be separate because the Soviet Union had just collapsed. But under your logic of the countries are sovereign, we can't get involved, you should be against
Wait, do you
Chechnya.
think that
Because
the
Chechnya
US
was
should
part
have-
of the Russian government, wasn't it? It was part of the Russian territory.
The U.S. should have gone in Chechnya?
Probably not.
Probably not.
Hold on.
Indeed.
Just because of the expense and the kind of geopolitical reality on the
And
ground.
the geography of where it is, like, and how are you going to transport the weapons? And that's whatever.
From a moral
From a moral perspective, we would have been
perspective, I
justified.
think
Yeah.
Here's the difference. The Chechens have their own identity. They have their own culture and religion and these things that separate them distinctly from the Russians. And I think gives their call for like independence, like reason and, strength. And we had good reason to believe that the majority of Chechens probably wanted some separation. We were not given that indication in Crimea, despite what he's saying. We were not given that indication in the Donbass. And I don't believe that the best future for these nation states were part of Russia. And I think that has been borne out from the economic condition of the Donbass right now. But it's not a question of just like and I do agree that like just caring only about sovereignty, there are things that trounce that. The brutalization, war crimes, stuff like that. But again, Ukraine did not attack on like some 9/11 style. Like there was not a harboring of terrorists. The Afghanistan comparison, I don't think is accurate. And when we talk about Chechnya, we know for sure that the vast majority of those people wanted to separate. We know that. We don't know that for Crimea and the Donbass. So even if we wanted to make that comparison, I don't think you can.
Yeah.
We would have been justified.
We would have strong justification.
Again, until the like the Balkans, right? When we went
Winter
in,
skeptics, 6 foot of tier 1.
when NATO went in the 90s, right, and stopped the Serbian genocide that was happening there, that the Serbians were conducting, right?
NATO offensive.
Yes, that was good. That was something we should have done, right? And when it comes to the war crimes, like we talk about when war crimes justify intervention, look at Bucha. What happened in Bucha?
498 better if he said it right.
98 civilians massacred. Does that justify the U.S. getting involved? I think it does. Look at what they've done by stealing 20,000 at least children, Ukrainian children, and disappearing them into Russia to serve with Russian families, to live with Russian families, and to be raised as Russian against the will of their parents.
Can you even
does
state,
that justify?
Can you even
does that justify U.S.
Hold on. When you say against the will of their parents, what do you mean?
I mean that the parents, they're not allowed to see the kids.
Is that what's happening?
That is.
Do you even know what the Russian argument is on that?
Sociopathogen got a tier 2 subscription. Here's a few bucks for your war chest.
Thank you for the tier 2. What do you mean? Why are we going to debate the morality of the kidnapping and trafficking of children? Is that the Russian argument, for those who are curious, is that we're taking the children from the war zone and we're transporting them somewhere safe. Now, even if we were to buy that, number one, what about the kidnapping of children from orphanages and the smuggling of them out of the country? That I don't really understand how that aligns with the strategy of protecting them. But also, it's supposed to be exported to a third-party country, i.e. like a Switzerland or a Norway, to stop a situation where, say, the children could be kidnapped. Also, the parents are not allowed to contact them. Like he said, many of them are not allowed to contact their families. And some kids are just straight up told things like, hey, like your parents don't want you anymore. You're Russian now. And they send them to camps that celebrate Russianness and being Russian and try to tell them to, speak Russian when they can't. Like this is happening. They have adopted out children that they have living family members left in Ukraine.
I don't care why they're
orphans.
doing it. It's wrong.
They're orphans.
They're not all orphans. They are not all orphans. A lot of them were orphans taken from Ukrainian orphanages. Why should they do that? Imagine we get invaded and then they look, oh, the Chinese decided that all of the Californian orphans are going back to Beijing to be adopted out to Chinese families. Like that's no.
And if the parents are identified, they ship them back to Ukraine.
That's not necessarily true. I know some people that Save Ukraine. That's not necessarily true. And it's not just about, hey, if their family members are identified. What about if they have other family members that like to take them? And let's say they are orphans. They should still be sent back to Ukraine to be part of the Ukrainian orphanage system. Should we we invade Iraq, all the Iraqi children, all the Iraqi orphans are now American orphans? No.
Orphans. They're orphans. It is absolutely true. They're orphans in combat zones.
That is not true.
That's not true in all instances. It's true in certain instances. I remember that orphan directors in Kherson had to hide the children in closets as the Russians went door to door during the evacuation, trying to hoist them away.
Orphans in combat zones. That is 100% true. Now, you could say, well, Russia has an obligation to send the orphans to Ukraine. That could be a discussion. But again,
what do you mean a discussion? That's just true. Does he refuse to concede anything? Of course they have an obligation to send it back to Ukraine. Under international law, you want to talk about the legitimacy of any of this?
Wait, hold
on. The framing here,
children should be reunited with their families if we're able?
Wick, they're orphans. They don't have families.
That's not true. He's lying. Now, he lies about the polling data. He lies about kidnapped, trafficked Ukrainian children. Not all of them are orphans. And let's say, again, if you say someone's an orphan, if there are living family members that want to take them, what does that mean? What does that mean? If there's an aunt or an uncle that's willing to take them in and the Russians are deciding to keep them, what is that? Because the way that when you say it's orphan, you make it sound like, oh, there's nobody that wants them, there was a Ukrainian orphanage system that those kids could be at. But also there's other kids that were handed over because their parents were basically told, like, look, to keep them safe, that's the only thing you do. You should hand your kids over to us. And they did, under the expectation from their aunt or whoever handed them over that they'd get them back, and they haven't. The vast majority of kidnapped Ukrainian children have not been returned. I think it's only like over 300 out of the 20,000.
They don't have families.
But
it's
they
in a
do
combat
in
zone.
many cases.
And if they
their parents are saying, "Give us back our kids,"
and every month when they identify parents, they do send them back.
They are making it very, very hard to identify
you're all over
parents.
the place. First,
I'm not all over the place. You are all over the place.
No, first
again, let me ask you one more
you're saying,
time.
let me ask you one more time.
You keep not answering the question. Does the Bucha massacre justify, because you have agreed that violence...
Wait, this doesn't know. I just don't know about the specifics. Go donate to Save Ukraine. They help bring the kids back. Why do organizations like Save Ukraine have to do what they do and send, in order to, you have to send, the mom has to go all the way to Russia. They don't send them back. They send it back to Ukraine. The moms have to make the trip all the way to Russia to retrieve their children from these places or from these other families they're getting adopted out to. Like, it's not, they make the process as difficult as possible. That's why organizations like Save Ukraine exist, in order to get these kids back.
Of human rights allow us, or allow a foreign country to go in militarily, right? So if Bucha is not enough for you, is them snatching these 20,000 orphans, as you call them, off the streets and disappearing them into the Russia, is that not enough for you? What about all the other war crimes that have been recognized by the UN, by the ICJ, by the OSCE, right? By these other human rights watchdog groups that they know is happening in Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories, where they are forcing Ukrainian citizens to become Russian, get a Russian passport, and then they conscript the men and send them off to fight against Ukraine. Does that not justify?
Whoa. Hold on. We got a problem with conscription now? Okay, we got a couple questions.
No, I tap out. He's being slimy. I tap out. You have a problem with conscription now. You want to have a debate about conscription? Have a debate about the morality of conscription, okay? Every nation state in the world is going to force its people to defend it in a crisis in its own survival, okay? So if we're going to hold this standard for Ukraine, okay, we should hold the standard for all nation states. But his problem wasn't conscription. The problem is the illegal, under international law, forced conscription of people in occupied territory. This is the equivalent of the Chinese invading, I guess, my state, and then telling me, pick up a gun, you have to go kill Virginians. And then using us in some of the worst, I don't want to call it meat wave, but I'm just going to be blunt, meat wave style assaults. Those Donbass militias had some of the highest rates of casualties in the entire Russian armed forces. Even when you're in occupied Ukraine and you've got that Russian passport, you're still a Ukrainian, and they'll treat you like one.
Questions here
yes, if you are making someone
Wick, please. A couple points here. First of all, you didn't know what was going on with the orphans. You were saying, the children.
I'm sorry. And he discussed this. He is making Russia seem saintly. I mean, he can say that, I have problems with Russia. Oh, they've taken these orphans out and they're trying to protect them, and it's just if he doesn't think that these children won't be immediately used as diplomatic leverage by the Russians as negotiations come around, I mean, come. I think I'm done. I think I'm done for the night. It'd be one thing if we were negotiating America's foreign policy stance in the world, and instead we talked about, should America have this role as defending our, but instead we're debating the ethics of trafficking Ukrainian children. We're talking about, how illegitimate Euromaidan. This is the discussion we're having. What he's doing is, I think he's trying to drag Wick into the specifics that he's maybe one layer deep under in. And Wick would need to be a few layers deeper to understand, like, wait a second, let's talk about the economic coercion that happened before. Or wait a second, let's talk about what the work Save Ukraine does. Why does Save Ukraine have to exist? Lactoids learn nothing. He's repeating the same things that he, at this point, should know is a lie. Slimy slime. Ay, ay, ay. Do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do-do. So I think we're gonna end stream there. I've been sick for the last few days. I didn't know if I was even gonna stream today, but I really wanted to make sure I did so we could cover this debate. On Monday and Tuesday, we have 2 back-to-back debates.